alliance of more than 380 European organisations running a self-organised European citizen initiative against Ttip and CETA. Now, I've been invited to chair tonight's event, and on behalf of the ECI, the European Citizen Initiative, you're going to hear from Mary MacPherson, who's from Le Havre. To say this is the third in our series. The first was at Fort William. The second was last Friday night in Oban. Just to lay out the ground rules here, ECI are opposed to Ttip, but the purpose of this event is to hear all the pros and cons from all the parties on this. Now, I've not been advised that there's to be a fire alarm, so if the alarm does go off, I'm sure we'll all retreat in an orderly manner. The other things I want to say are that the format will be that I'll do a brief introduction to each of the candidates. They'll be offered the opportunity to, well, first of all, we'll hear from Mary MacPherson from ECI. She'll speak for up to 10 minutes on the issue of Ttip. I'll do a brief introduction of the candidates. They'll speak for up to 5 minutes on the issue from the lectern. They won't take questions at that point because we're going to take questions after that. What I would like to say is politics can be very combative, and I think that's sometimes very good. But the purpose of this meeting is to hear the candidates who've been invited here's views, and we'll do so in a courteous manner. They'll be asked questions in a courteous manner, and I'm sure that's the way they'll engage. Please come. Now, there are a number of candidates. The people who were invited who didn't attend were Mr. Alexander, the sitting MP. And it's fair to record that every effort was made to have Mr. Alexander attend by trying to accommodate things within his time frame. That didn't work out. Mary, who has been organising this event, was told a replacement would be put in place, and then yesterday told that a statement would be offered. Now, I'm chairing this event entirely impartially, but the purpose of any hustings is for you, the voters, to have the opportunity to question potential elected representatives. Clearly, if I read a statement from someone, you're not in a position to challenge that statement. So my view was that the statement shouldn't be accepted. I discussed that with the candidates. I didn't hear any dissent. In any case, the decision is mine. But that explains why your MP isn't here. So I hope that was done as diplomatically as possible. So first of all, we're going to hear from Mary MacPherson. It's a very broad coalition, the European Citizens Initiative, and as I say, across Europe. Mary is from Le Havre, and she's leading on this issue, and this is the third in a series. As I say, there hopefully will be more hustings elsewhere. So Mary would like to speak first.
To speak to you today about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or Ttip for short. Ttip is a trade deal conducted entirely in secret between the EU and the US and aims to harmonise barriers. Harmonisation is doublespeak for taking the lowest level of regulation in either the US or EU and applying it across the board. The barriers they speak of are our prized and hard-earned regulations and standards that protect our labour rights, environment, food standards, digital privacy and banking regulations. Let's break this down and see what specific things are under threat by Ttip. All public services, not just the NHS, are in the firing line. One of the main aims of Ttip is to open up Europe's public health, education and water services to US companies. This could essentially mean the privatisation of the NHS. Public services are normally protected from free trade agreements. However, because commercial companies now in part provide the NHS, it will only be protected from Ttip if it's explicitly excluded from the treaty, which currently it's not. Ttip will create new markets in public services such as health and education, leading to greater liberalisation and privatisation. It would also make it very difficult to bring back these services, such as our energy and water, back under public control or renationalise them. Ttip will also affect standards of healthcare professional practice. A government's ability to regulate professional standards and qualifications for healthcare workers could be restricted, with worrying implications for patient care. If the Scottish NHS is not exempt from Ttip, it will be a disaster. The The Scottish Government has so far protected the NHS as much as it can within the limits of the Scottish budget. However, Ttip will mean that we will not have a choice. We will be forced to open up NHS services to multinational companies in Europe and America. If we refuse, we will be sued by corporate lawyers and secret industry courts. The UK Government's position is now clear. They are not seeking exemptions from Ttip. They also want to relax banking regulations, but Ttip cuts both ways. The UK, under the influence of the all-powerful City of London, is thought to be seeking a loosening of US banking regulations. America's financial rules are tougher than ours. They were put into place after the financial crisis to directly curb the powers of the bankers and avoid a similar crisis happening again. Ttip will remove those restrictions, effectively handing all the powers back to the bankers. This will hasten a newer, bigger crash than the last time, and even tougher austerity to bail them out. The American Chamber of Commerce is also using Ttip as an opportunity to push for the higher US financial service regulations to be watered down. In this day and age, why would the EU and the US want to give powers back to the bankers? Jobs will be at risk. The EU has admitted that Ttip will cause unemployment as jobs switch to the USA, where labour standards and trade union rights are lower. Businesses could relocate to the US states and EU countries with the lowest labour standards. Your labour rights at risk are the national minimum wage, your working time rights, your health and safety protection, your right to join a union, and protection from unlawful discrimination at work. Jobs at risk include manufacturing, pharmaceutical industry, the NHS, and agriculture. You could say that every job would be at risk from competition from abroad. Main political parties argue that Ttip will bring increased jobs and growth. There is little credible evidence for these claims, which rely heavily on the assessment made by the Centre for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR. CEPR research must be viewed with caution because of its poor quality and because the research cannot be seen as unbiased. CEPR is funded by the same international banks that are keen to see Ttip signed. The main body of research claims that growth from Ttip will bring a family of 4 an extra €545 a year. But this gain is not per annum, it's over 10 years. I've got a quote from Geronimo Capaldo from Tufts University in Massachusetts. He's a research fellow. At the same time, Ttip will put extra pressure on countries that treat their workers well in terms of pay, because these countries will find themselves in fiercer competition with the US and with other economies with low production costs stemming from low wages. Increased unemployment and falling wages will reduce demand and send the economy into a downward spiral and increase the pressure on public finances. Capaldo further predicts in his paper that Ttip will see a reduction in the working class's share of output. He predicts a transfer of 7% of UK GDP to from labour to profit income. It's 100 billion or more. This would have a devastating effect on the working class living standards, and with increased power to corporations and a weakening of the working class's ability to fight back. Ttip is undemocratic in its process. Its ongoing negotiations are done in secret, kept away from MPs and MEPs. When powerful people in government and business conduct things in secret, it's obvious they don't want the domestic population to find out what they're up to. Once negotiators sign the treaty, Westminster, like other EU member states, will only be able to vote to accept or reject the Ttip treaty as a whole. They will not be able to amend it in any way. Ttip will also affect your privacy. If you remember ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, a massive majority in the European Parliament threw it out in 2012 after a huge public backlash against what was rightly seen as an attack on individual privacy, where internet service providers would be required to monitor people's online activity. Well, Ttip could bring back ACTA's central elements, proving that if a democratic approach, there's always a back door. Let's look at this ISDS clause. The Ttip deal will give more right to companies through a clause called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement. If included in the deal, this will enable corporations to claim damages in secret courts or arbitration panels if they deem their profits are adversely affected by changes in a regulation or policy. This will threaten democratically agreed laws designed to protect communities and the environment. Companies which claim their investments, including expectations of future profits, will be affected by a change in government policy, will have the right to seek compensation through private international tribunals. ISDS is already happening in other countries through different trade deals. El Salvador, Pacific Rim Mining Company, which is now owned by OceanaGold, is suing the government for $315 million after being refused permission for a gold mining project. Egypt is currently being sued by Viola for raising the minimum wage, and they're going to lose $80 million. Germany, Vattenfall is suing for $3.7 billion after the country voted to phase out nuclear power. Slovakia lost $30 million against the Dutch insurance company Achmea for reversing the country's unpopular privatisation of health insurance. And the big one in Australia was Philip Morris. He's suing them, the Australian public health law, for cigarettes being sold in plain packaging. Lowering our food standards, on the gov.uk website, it's called Increasing Business with the USA. It says that it's working to lower sanitary measures and other barriers to lower sanitary measures and other barriers to high quality British food and drink. If you look on Wikipedia, it's also known as the SPS agreement, which is easier to say. The World Trade Organization sets constraints on member states' policies related to food safety, bacterial contaminants, pesticide inspection and labelling, as well as animal and plant health with respect to imported pests and diseases. European health and safety checks will be lowered, having a direct effect upon our food safety: GM food, chemically treated food, synthetic food. It will remove food safety regulations to allow new GM crops, hormone pump beef and chlorine washed chicken. The impacts on the environment. Ttip would abolish trade restrictions on energy between the US and EU, leading to increased fossil fuel exports. This despite grave warnings from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that if we do not end our dependency on fossil fuels, we are heading for a climate catastrophe. Any relaxation of trade restrictions would encourage further oil and gas developments such as fracking. It would also aim to remove Washington's current ban on exporting crude oil and boost exports of shale gas, which would require investment in terms of port facilities in Europe and draw both financial and political capital away from cleaner alternatives and further damage the environment. A further concern is the harmonisation of environmental standards, downgrading current protections. Ttip could undermine the important EU precautionary principle, which provides that where actions or policies might be a danger to the environment or health of citizens, then there is a duty of care to prevent that. We should be raising standards to protect our health and the environment and improve our food system, not lowering them. So the UK currently has 98 trade deals, and you need to think, would Ttip impede on other trade deals with other countries? Chris Banbury, the Scottish author, says that the result of Ttip would be create the biggest trade bloc in the world. The US already has similar agreements with Canada and Mexico, so they would inevitably be part of it. And in boardrooms on both sides of the Atlantic, directors are licking their lips. The creation of such a trade bloc, which excludes China and Russia and the other states, can only sharpen tension between the latter states and the US and Europe. You could also take, for example, of previous failed trade agreements that did not deliver the promise of higher employment and GDP growth. The one called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, Mexico, and America. It was 20 years ago that NAFTA was implemented. The promised trade pluses with Mexico turned out to be deficits, and hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost. We have to look to Mexico as an example of how these trade agreements are not about raising living standards, trade or free markets. Out of 20 Latin American countries, South Central America plus Mexico, Mexico ranks 18th, with a growth of less than 1% annually since 1994. From 1960 to 80, Mexico's GDP per capita nearly doubled. This amounted in huge increases in living standards for the vast majority of Mexicans. And if the country had continued to grow at this rate, it would have something approaching European living standards today. Mexico's growth has remained below 1% since 2000. Mexico's national poverty rate in 2012 was 53%, basically the same it was in 1994. Without economic growth, it's difficult to reduce poverty in a developing country. The statistics would look even worse if not for the migration that took place during this period. Millions of Mexicans were displaced from farming after being forced into competition with subsidised and high productivity agribusiness in the US, thanks to NAFTA's rules. Excuse me. Got a Noam Chomsky quote about trade agreements. GATT, NAFTA and the like are called free trade agreements, but this is a misdescription. Firstly, the term trade hardly applies to a system in which some 40% of US trade is intra-firm, centrally managed by the same high visible hands that control planning, production and investment. Over half of US exports to Mexico, for example, do not enter the Mexican market, consisting of transfers from one branch to another of a US corporation, to maximise gains from lower labour costs and environmental standards. Currently, the trade between the UK and the US is $214 billion, and there are over 1 million UK jobs in the US, and this info comes from UKUStrade.com. If this is truly to be a high standards agreement, and if there is any hope that harmonisation does not mean shifting standards towards a lowest common denominator, then the US and EU governments need to start a thorough redefinition of regulatory coherence that prioritises human and environmental well-being over market openings. That seems to be entirely improbable given the statements made by the governments up to this point. A rework deal would have to be ratified by the 28 governments of the EU and Congress in the US. However, the newly elected leftist Syriza government in Greece has already said it would not approve the pact. Ttip and the secrecy surrounding its negotiations are a reckless, unjustified destruction of our rights. Ttip without ISDS is still a threat as it will strip Scotland of all our rights. Employment and labour rights that previous generations fought so hard for, and the environment and food standards that food safety standards that we strive to protect. Ttip is not for the benefit for the working class of Scotland. It's purely a trade treaty for the benefit of big faceless corporations and their shareholders. And also, Ttip's not something to be picked over, opposing some elements while favouring others. Either you're fully opposed to it or support it. If you care about democracy, workers' rights and the environment, you must oppose Ttip and support the ECI campaign. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mary. Mary is organising these series of events on behalf of the European Citizens Initiative, and that earns her latitude with timing. Now, she did very well. It was 12 minutes in Oban, but overran quite a bit there. But that doesn't mean that our panel, as hosts, ECI are allowed a bit of latitude. What I'm going to do now, folks, is I'm going to introduce our panel to you, and I'm going to do so in alphabetical order. Trying to desperately hard using word count and all sorts of formula to make these bios as fair as possible, because they all vary within what's available on the web. First, with the surname Henry, that's Drew Henry. Drew's immediately on my left here. Drew's a councillor for BADENOCH and has been so since 2007. He's the leader of the Highland SME group since 2011 and leader of the Highland Council since 2012. He's a former director with a multinational appliance manufacturer and founded Inverness-based Techland Limited. Drew is keen to play an active role in delivering a fairer, more just, prosperous Scotland. Next, Edward on my right here, Edward Mountain, is the Conservative candidate. Edward's a former chair of the Highland Conservatives and contested Caithness Sutherland Ross for the Conservative Party in the 2011 Scottish election. He's a former surveyor, serviceman, and is a third-generation farmer who is passionate about the Highlands. Edward believes a strong and experienced business voice at Westminster can help the constituency grow. Next, on far right there, is Isla O'Reilly. Isla's the Scottish Green Party candidate. Isla has a degree in biomedical science and worked in the medical device industry before having children. She teaches Pilates, helps in the family organic farm business, and does community work involving traditional music. Isla was active with Green Yes campaign and developed a strong desire to bring about a change in politics that puts people, the planet and peace at the forefront of all decisions. On the left, Mike's the Scottish Labour Party candidate. Mike has a degree in physics from Edinburgh University and has worked in the software and electronics industry for most of his professional career. He contested the 2010 UK election for Inverness, near BADENOCH, STRATHSPEY, and now runs his own UK-wide IT business from Inverness. Mike's priorities are jobs for young people, getting more houses built, protecting the NHS, and building an economy that works for all, not just the bankers. So could you welcome your candidates, please? We're going to continue in that order, and then we'll rotate thereafter, if I can get my system right with that. So first, for up to 5 minutes, if you lets me get this stopwatch, if the battery doesn't run out the phone, which is likely, is Drew Henry. Thank you. I should say I'll let the candidates know when there's 30 seconds to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. Thank you to Mary for her comprehensive coverage of the Ttip agenda. And I think it is something that merits a great deal of discussion. I've heard Ttip described variously as an undemocratic corporate power grab and something to be worried about, and something that, on the other hand, is something that's going to remove tariffs, cut red tape, and boost jobs and opportunity across the piece. But I think when you were listening to Mary there and talking about the process for it, it really comes down to the nub of the issue. Because what we know about Ttip is very, very little indeed. Because all of the conversations about that particular agreement have been held behind closed doors. They've not been accessible by even elected politicians in Europe. Alan Smith, MEP, the SNP MEP, has written quite widely of his frustration at having to go into a locked chamber and to look at documents before being asked to come out and being sworn to secrecy. It's like the Official Secrets Act to actually get in to look at any document in the European Parliament. Those of you who were here at the beginning of the week for the Cabinet meeting would have heard Cabinet Secretary Richard Lockhead tell you of his experiences being allowed to sit at the back of the room in European meetings where the UK and other ministers would then go into a private lunch to discuss Ttip away from his ears. And that's the big problem with Ttip. It could be that there are some benefits in it. There probably are some real live dangers in it, but we just don't have the detail. And that is undemocratic. It is a problem, and it is something that we have to take very seriously. Now, the SNP position is that we believe there should be, in the light of that, an absolute specific exemption for the NHS. That it's far too important for us to take a risk with the UK government signing up to something after the European agreement that actually puts that at risk. Now, those of us who've used the NHS, my youngest daughter was born in Raigmore under our NHS, and I was very privileged at the time when they discovered that she had a small heart condition at the time, to get the kind of attention that we get under our NHS. And it was a very, very delicate time for me and my family, but we know that that might not have been uncovered elsewhere because of the pressures that the NHS or another organisation might have been under, had there been more insistence on doing things more efficiently in the name of making sure that they're maximising profit. So I've got a very personal reason to make sure that we're protecting our NHS here. Fortunately, she was fine. We moved on and she was able to develop into a healthy baby. But that just gave me an insight into why it's important for us to protect and make sure that we are making a provision that says that you just cannot interfere with that from forces outside of our government here. So Ttip not only must protect the NHS, it must not restrict scope for decisions at any level of government, public authority or NHS organisation, as I've said, relating to public health care. It must not give current or future US investors new rights that they could use to sue any level of government, as Mary said. That's something that shouldn't happen. They shouldn't be able to also sue any public authority or NHS organisation. So we've called on the Prime Minister, and we will call on whoever is the Prime Minister, to make a clear statement to the European Trade Council that the UK will veto TTIP unless the NHS is fully and clearly exempted from that treaty. Now, as I said, we don't know the detail, and clearly, if there is to be an agreement, we won't have here within Scotland the ability to veto that. Only the UK as a member state will be able to do that. But if there is going to be a trade agreement that's actually signed on that, we want to make sure that Scotland gains the maximum benefit from that. It's estimated that it could be between £4 to £10 million. Now, that could be very important for us, but it is absolutely vital that that comes out of the darkness and into the clear so that you can see what it's about. That's our position. Thank you.
Drew set the bar very high there with timekeeping. I'm sure the other candidates are going to hear. We'll hear next from Ed.
Don't start the clock yet.
Well, we'll give you a wee minute, Clark. Get 6 stumps in position. Right, on you go.
Murray, thank you for asking us along. I guess that you and I are going to disagree for most of the evening on the provisions of TTIP, but I'm going to tell you how I see it. First of all, the EU and the US are each other's biggest trading partners. In 2011, it was worth about £4 billion a day each way, or in 2010, the total trade between the two was worth $3 trillion. Now, it's not all perfect trade between the two. We can't export our haggis. As a farmer, that's important to me. We can't export our sportswear without getting a 32% tariff from America. We can only operate in about 30% of the US markets as far as internal procurement is concerned. And for example, in America, all internal flights have to be operated by American Airlines. It's not great. It could be a lot better, and there's a lot to play for. Now, as far as the negotiations are concerned, the European Commissioner, represented by the Trade Directorate, who negotiate on behalf of the 500 million people within the EU. And they do that from a position of strength. Now, in June 2013, when it all started, we'd really not got a great deal down the road as far as negotiations are concerned. We'd really agreed the negotiating positions, not the actual points to be negotiated. The Commission have a legal obligation to report all events to the Council, where our members of government sit, and they also have to speak to the Parliament, where our MEPs sit. And they also have to speak to a special committee of MEPs called the European Trade Committee, who work purely on TTIP. So effectively, there's 3 levels of control. And there's one more level of control, Murray, which I think you might have missed, that from the 1st of December 2014, all meetings and minutes held by the EU civil servants must be published on EU websites. If you like a note of the website domain, I'll give it to you afterwards. And that's where the TTIP documents are published. Now, we are negotiating 3 areas within TTIP: market access, removal of trade barriers, and improved cooperation, and the ability to settle disputes. And what we have to understand is where the EU are coming from on this. We are not going to allow the EU to dilute the level of protection that is currently within Europe. So health, environment, and consumer protection cannot be diluted. And we can opt for carve-outs. For example, the US have already declared that they want to carve out for water supplies in their country can only be done by American companies. That's fine, and we could do the same. As far as NHS is concerned, that is not going to be privatised. Let me be clear. Let me quote the EU Commissioner, Director General for Trade, who said, "On the NHS, TTIP does not affect the UK or devolve government sovereignty over how the NHS services are provided, whether in Scotland and the rest of the UK." And, he said, the net effect of the EU's approach is that nothing with TTIP will lead to the privatisation of NHS. And, he went on again in another letter saying, any government's decision to open up the publicly funded health service to market competition could be subsequently rolled back. So, for example, in Scotland, if we were allowing Weight Watchers, a US company, to look after parts of the National Health Service, which we're doing at the moment, we could claw that back if we no longer decided it was the right thing to do. So where will it affect the NHS? Well, it will affect the NHS in the supply of pharmaceuticals and the supply of medical devices. Now, other areas that have been mentioned, food, let's talk about that. We have to accept that the US will come to the EU with our standards. Now, as a farmer, that's important to me because I don't want beef coming in from America that's been grown using steroids. And it's not going to be. And nor are we going to allow chicken in that's been washed with chlorine. If you don't believe me, we raised this very issue last week with Commissioner Hogan in the EU. I had a question raised to him, and he's part of the TTIP negotiations, and he's confirmed that. I have the press release available for people to see afterwards if they want to. So the final question is that the government could be sued. Well, we've not yet agreed what investor protection will be. We haven't got that far. It's open to stakeholder consultation within the EU. Now, let me just say this to you, that since 1975, the UK has entered into 94 bilateral trade agreements with ISDS, which is this trade protection clauses in, and we've never been sued. Why would we sue now? So summary, my summary. TTIP, if properly implemented, could be good for the UK. There are 3 levels of control. There'll be no reduction in our standards. There are open negotiations, you can read them on the website, and I believe we've got clear assurances about the concerns that have been raised tonight, all of which will be on display after the meeting. Thank you.
That was 18 seconds, that's not bad. There was some serial offenders in Oban, I have to tell you. I'll not say who, so that would be inappropriate. Right, the next we're going to hear from is Isla from the Scottish Field Party.
Hi there. Apologies, I've got another cold. I think I had a cold last time I was in here speaking as well, so a wee bit husky, but I'll try and soldier on. A lot of what I was going to say will really just be echoing what Marie said in terms of the problems that we see with TTIP. It's interesting when you hear Edward saying that it's all going to be okay, because so much of it is held in secret that how does he know that it's all going to be okay? 92% of the people that have been involved with the discussions so far have been corporate lobbyists. Not elected people that have been sent by you or I, but corporate lobbyists. The whole thing about it being done in secret is completely anti-democratic. It's not a democratic process. Molly Scott-Cato, who's one of our European MEPs, has written about how she had to go into this locked room that Drew talked about in order to be able to read some of the documents. They're all written in legalese. She said it's very difficult to get any kind of real sense or information from the documents. She had to sign a 17-page document to say that she wouldn't say anything to anyone about what she saw. She had to leave all her personal belongings in a locker and was accompanied into a locked room. She couldn't tell us what she saw in there, but she did tell us that she thought that there was absolutely no democratic process involved whatsoever, and that the trade agreement was operating not on behalf of citizens, but on behalf of corporations. And this is something that the Green Party is really keen on, is making sure that our politicians are there to represent people, not corporations. The tariffs that you talk about, they're actually at an all-time low between the US and the UK, so really it's not an excuse to use that as a reason why we need TTIP. This thing as well about more trade equals more economic growth. Is this really something that we see coming to fruition? They talk constantly about this trickle-down economy, where by putting money in at the top, it'll somehow trickle down to the rest of us, and that simply doesn't happen. It's not something that we see in reality. The harmonisation of standards is what you talked about there, Marie, in terms of animal welfare, food quality, labour rights and energy sources. All of these things are under threat by a trade agreement such as this. It's not just enough to take out the NHS. Rightly so, the NHS has been brought up as one of the main things that we want to make sure is carved out of this, but we want to see many things carved out of this agreement, and not just the NHS. The public procurement's one that we were talking about there. We really should be able to use the public procurement for things such as social enterprises, organisations that have a social aim as well as just a money-making aim, and that's something that simply won't be able to happen underneath this trade agreements. The investor-state dispute settlement is frightening, really frightening when you start looking into it. And if you want any kind of indication as to how that will happen, then just look at Canada. Canada is constantly fighting battle after battle in the courts at the moment. The investor-state dispute settlement is not a judicial system, it's an arbitration panel of corporate lawyers. There's no representation from anyone else, and there's absolutely no judicial review. Why do we need it? What is wrong with the system that we have at the moment in our courts and in our law system? Absolutely nothing. There's simply no need for it whatsoever. Things like that could stop us from renationalising the railways if we so decided to. We could be stopped from keeping the NHS private. I mean, I actually laughed when you said, you know, that the NHS will not be privatised. He's right, because Cameron's already privatising the NHS as we speak. Is more trade needed? Do we need more free trade, or do we need more fair trade? I would suggest that we need more of the latter. We need to make an economy that's much more circular, one where we actually see the benefits locally of what's made and produced. With multinational corporations, 90 pence in every pound goes out of a local economy. With local businesses, 80 pence of every pound stays in. The Greens are really the only party that is completely against this trade agreement. Everyone else is kind of either sitting on the fence or completely for it. I welcome the SNP stance on it, but there continues to be talk of opportunities. We don't see that there's any opportunities with this, and it's something that we're absolutely, totally opposed to. And I'm done anyway, so I'm going to be before time. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, it's not a race, but a bit wet. Now, finally, we're going to hear from member of the Labour.
John. Thanks, John. Thanks, Marie. And again, thanks for organising this kind of event tonight. I think one of the things that struck me about this election campaign compared to the 2010 campaign is the sheer interest that so many people are taking in so many different issues as this election progresses. And I think it's great tonight to have an opportunity for all our different views to listen and talk and discuss it with you. I think it's healthy for our democracy in Scotland. Now, when it comes to TTIP, I expect a lot of people in this room we're always going to disagree. I think a lot of it comes down to your worldview about capitalism and the system in which our world operates. I come from a strand of thinking in the Labour Party that is deeply distrustful of big corporations and their motivations, but equally is very concerned about the power to create jobs, grow our economy, and create better standards of living for all of us. And in that context, trade agreements like TTIP, particularly between two of the most powerful economic blocs in the world, the US and Europe, I think have a role to play. I mean, back in the late 1940s, it was Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin who put the NHS and the welfare state together, who negotiated what became the GATT agreement, which for all its imperfections was a large part of what allowed the British economy to recover after the war. So trade agreements have their place. But the Labour Party's position on this is quite clear, and I can take this right from the heart of my old comrade in Edinburgh, Ian Murray, who's the current Labour shadow spokesman for business who has this role. Labour's view on this is very clear. We absolutely need to have more open discussion, transparency, about what is being negotiated. And I think in that we will all share that position. But Labour goes beyond that. It's saying four very clear things about TTIP. Four things we will absolutely insist. We are the government after May the 7th of this year. That agreement will not be passed unless it meets four standards. First of all, if the NHS is not excluded from TTIP, we will not support it. An absolute statement. Secondly, an ISDS, which is a very technical area, which is all about allowing corporations to challenge countries which go back on commercial agreements. There's always been ISDS statements in trade agreements. But Labour's position is very clear that we want to see within TTIP the right for national governments to, in effect, exclude the operation of that clause in areas where there's clear public interest. So, the example is renationalising the railway, which is something I would like to see in this country. We would want to have the right to actually exclude that from that agreement. That's very important. Thirdly is about standards. There's absolutely no point in having an agreement with something like TTIP if it drives standards down. TTIP should be about driving standards up. That's standards of employment, standards of workers' rights, standards to belong to a trade union. And that's not just about standards in this country, that's about raising those rights and those standards in the United States as well, which is something we'd like to see. And finally, a slightly technical point is about reciprocity. The agreement as it's currently written is all about national level trading. We would like to see that TTIP opens up trade agreements at state level in the US, which would allow the UK for the very first time to do a lot of exporting into the US at state level, which is where a lot of the buying goes on, which is currently blocked through a number of the existing trade agreements. So those are the four things that the Labour Party would like to see put in place in TTIP, and we will not support the TTIP agreement without those four conditions being in place. The UK government needs to engage, needs to consult, and it needs to negotiate about TTIP. It needs to be active. To date, it's not been doing that. I think it is unfortunate that our current MP who can come here and speak to the heart of what the UK government is doing, are not able to hear that. That's what we would like to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panel for these opening remarks. The format now is that I'll take questions from the floor. The sort of things we envisage being covered are the NHS public and public services, renationalisation and the challenges that may be about that. You've heard all the panellists talk about food and safety standards, also environmental standards being lowered, the risks, jobs and labour standards, banking regulation being relaxed, and online privacy, which I don't think any of them touched on, and ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement, which has significant implications where it's saying that the courts that are good enough for you, me, and most business aren't appropriate for that particular trade deal. So, short questions please, and I'm sure we'll get concise answers. Gentleman in front.
Alan Mackenzie. I'd just like to ask, I'm very disappointed that Diana Sanders isn't here tonight. I'd like to ask Mary, what is his excuse for not being here tonight?
Well, let me say that we heard from, every effort was made to have Mr. Alexander attend on the 25th of March, which is 3 days ago. Dear Mary, I've not had any luck finding a replacement, although I'm still trying. In the absence of a speaker, I'd be happy to supply a statement on TTIP from Danny to be read out, and that was from his office manager. That's all the discussion we need to have about people who are not here.
Right, okay. Can I just finish off by saying you're seen today at Fujitsu, and in the afternoon there's in bar 1. I think that at this space that my MP is not there. And if that's a seat, I'd like to give him a presentation.
No, well, please just sit down, please. I think we're here to hear a discussion on a subject. I'm not going to take any stunts or anything like that. Do you have a question? Okay, lady behind you, yes.
Can I ask a question, please, Eddie Mountain?
Well, we're going to ask all the questions to all the
panel. Oh, all the panel, yeah. Okay. You made
Wait, could you just say your name?
Oh, I'm Kay Kelly.
Kay.
Dr. Kay Kelly. You made an assertion that TTIP would not cause NHS privatisation and would not lead to hormone of beef and chlorine-washed chicken. Did you, what guarantees or penalties exist in TTIP to prevent that, or is it just speculation?
What I'll do is, in case people aren't getting the question was from Kay. She was really wanting it directed to Edward, and it was about the NHS, hormone beef, and a phrase that I've become familiar with, chlorine chicken, which is the extract. And
Cecilia Malistron, who's on the Trade Commission, who's doing the negotiations, and she is reflecting the views of the chair of the UK, the chair of the negotiation parties on behalf of the EU. First of all, it says, member states do not have to open the public health service to competition from private providers, nor do they have to outsource service to private providers. Member states are free to change their policies and bring back outsourced services back to the public sector whenever they choose to do so, in a manner respecting property rights, which we'd have to do anyway. So, mentioned nationalising railways or taking them back into public control, you'd have to respect the investments of the people who'd invested in them. You couldn't just appropriate them in UK law anyway. And the final point is, it makes no difference whether a member state already allows some services to be outsourced to private providers or not. So the US, for example, couldn't say, well, you already do that in other services, so you've got to let us do it in the National Health Service. So I'm absolutely convinced it can't happen. So as far as what penalties are involved, there are no penalties because it can't happen, and it just won't be allowed to happen into the UK. You can't bring, for example, steroid beef treated beef into the UK. It won't be allowed. So if they, you know, how do you legislate against that? For example, how do you legislate against illegal horse meat being sold as beef? If it happens, then there are consequences which are sorted out in law. It's not allowed, so the law will have to sort it out. There are nothing laid down as penalties, and I don't think it would be right to do so. But I can't stress enough. You know, this is from the chief negotiator's assistant. It can't be clearer. And you're very happy to have a copy of this letter. I'll email it to you tomorrow if you like.
Thank you, Esther. Isla?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Dr. Kelly, about what penalties exist if these things actually do happen. And it's saying that they don't have to happen. That doesn't say that they won't. And your question is spot on. If they do happen, then what penalties will exist? And we're hearing that there aren't any. Or we're just going in this lucky attitude that, you know, we'll wait and see what happens, and it's not going to, because we won't allow it. It's not what's happened in other trade agreements. It's not what's happened in Canada and the US and in Mexico, where they've seen this relaxation and they've got, you know, free trade where everything can go back and forth, and there's nothing that we can do about it once it's happened. And also with the introduction of the ISDS, then obviously if it does happen and the government turns around and says, no, we don't want this to happen, then they can be sued for loss of profits. And again, that's happening all the time just now with other countries. It's not something that we're thinking might happen, it's something that is happening. So you're absolutely right, there does need to be, if we're going to go ahead with this TTIP, very severe penalties for things that come into the country like that we don't want to see. I certainly don't want my kids eating chicken that's been washed in chlorine or beef that's been fed on steroids.
We can agree.
Yeah, but then my way of doing that obviously is to eat organic produce at all times.
Okay, before we go round the kitchen, I think we'll go to Mike for education.
For me, it's less about what penalties we put into these agreements, because when it comes to big international agreements like this, it's kind of like, if I can borrow the phrase, it's kind of shutting the door after the horse is bolted into the park in the first place. I think what we need to make sure is that the negotiations of the TTIP over the next year or so are absolutely transparent, and that our government is actively involved in it, and that we make sure that things like the NHS and the right level of ISDS provisions are either excluded or brought down to a point where they're to our benefit and not otherwise.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Danny Alexander openly supports TTIP, and I think the expression is there's no bigger barrier than distance. Well, he's certainly proven that tonight by being distant from this debate. But I think also Edward was underlining the fact that the Tories completely support TTIP as well. In fact, I think if I quote from them, they say, there's nothing at risk to the NHS, and it's nonsense to suggest otherwise. Well, why not then exclude the NHS? If it's nonsense to suggest otherwise, you could exclude it. There's no problem with doing that. And then we can all move on, and we don't have to worry about Kay's very, very pertinent question for it. We could just say it's exempt, because it doesn't matter anyway.
Yes, a question from the record, who is one of the candidates.
Thank you for the presentation. I was going to mention that, Steve mentioned it. I am one of the candidates, and
did everyone hear that the question was directed to Drew, and it was about why, as the questioner thought the Drew was confining his remarks to the NHS. We'll start with Isla this time.
Well, I totally agree. Why is it just the NHS that people are worried about? It seems to be that it's one of just those political hot potatoes that people are jumping onto the back of. We're opposed to the principle of this trade agreement, as we would be with any other trade agreement. So I'd like to know the answer to it too.
Can I discourage jumping in the back of anything that's hot, including potatoes? Yes. Mike.
I'm looking at this from a UK perspective. Whilst there are probably many occasions when Drew and I would disagree about the relative role of the Scottish NHS versus the UK NHS, I think on this occasion, the effect of TTIP, as I understand it's currently being drafted, will have the same effect on the NHS of Scotland as it would on the rest of the UK. So that's why I think it's important that we're opposed to it. I can't speak to Drew on further measures. The Labour Party doesn't want to go further than just the NHS. But I think I made that quite clear in my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Drew?
Well, there's two issues that you raised there. One is about the protection of the NHS in the context of TTIP, and I think actually Mike has explained that. The UK government have the control over signing up to this treaty, the secret treaty that's been negotiated out of sight of the Scottish Government. So we have no input, we have no sight in this country of the negotiations that are going on at the moment. That's why it's important from a UK-wide perspective that we lobby and we push and we argue for and we press for the specific exemption for the NHS to make sure that the effects of that overall agreement that's signed in Europe and are transferred here in the UK are not imposed on the Scottish NHS. But the point you were making about the protection of the NHS is a really good one, because we saw during the Better Together campaign that the NHS was safe. That's what we were told. Now we're running up to a general election and we're told the NHS is at risk from those parties that look to cut money from it in Scotland. Why is it at risk? Because if there's a reduction in the funding for the NHS UK-wide, that affects the funding that comes to Scotland and our ability to protect it. So the NHS is absolutely vital. It's very important to people here. It's absolutely crucial that we protect the NHS both from a financial perspective and from a legal perspective. And that's why I'm focusing on the NHS.
But can you answer the question, which is not about focusing on the importance of the NHS? The question is about why have you almost ring-fenced that and not gone across the board?
Well, I think during... Listen, I think what I said was that TTIP must not restrict the scope for decisions at any level of government. And I think you heard me say that from the podium earlier on. But what we're talking about here is that we don't know the details of the TTIP agreement. You've heard a number of people refer to the closed door activity that's going in Europe, the locked vaults that have to be accessed by security clearance.
Please let the question.
So actually it's very, very important that we know what the details are. And the UK as a member state is the only one that can either sign up or reject it.
Okay. I guess I seem to be the only one that is actually saying that I don't believe the NHS is included within TTIP. And I've offered evidence from letters from the Trade Commissioner who's actually negotiating TTIP on behalf of the EU. I'd just like to make a couple of observations, if I may. They keep talking about secrecy. Well, I learned an awful lot about TTIP by going on the websites, and I remind you that you can look on the websites and look up exactly what's being discussed by civil servants. If you've got a note or if you're recording it, it's trade.ec.europa.eu/doc-list/press/index.cfm?id equals 1230. If you're confused, I'll give it to you afterwards. And then there's this question on whether we should be supporting it in Scotland. Well, I don't need to remind Drew what his leader said about TTIP. But I'm going to quote her. I don't often quote Nicola, but I'm going to quote Nicola saying, earlier this month, the European Union and the USA, this was in 2013, announced that they would work to establish a transatlantic trade and investment partnership for Scotland, for whom the USA is our largest trading partner outside the EU. Such a partnership will be especially good news. Now, if you want details on how to link into that speech, contact me afterwards and I'll give it to you. So Nicola's supporting it. You're
selectively quoting it.
Well, I'm quoting a speech. I'm also giving you evidence here. And I actually would make one further point. I don't think there's any point scoring to be done on the National Health Service. I'm incredibly proud of the National Health Service. In fact, I've relied on it personally quite a lot. And I think it's a great service. I think there's great things that can be done with it. And I don't want Americans to come in and start taking over control of it. And if I thought there was any chance they would, I wouldn't be supporting this agreement. But I'm convinced by all the evidence that have been put in front of me, which I'm happy to put in front of you, that isn't the case.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Gentleman there.
Boyd. We've been here before.
Could you say?
Sorry,
Yes.
Boyd. Okay. We've been here before. Between 1999 and 95 and 1998, we had to deal with the multilateral agreement on investment. We are constantly being faced by these secretive trade deals and this whole arrangement. This is just another reincarnation in the form of Ttip. The key to this lies in the breakdown of the UN system, where the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs functioned between the 1950s up until the 1990s. My question to the panel is, are you in favour of going back to trade agreements negotiated openly and under the UN, the United Nations system? Because these deals are not operated in a transparent way, whereas the previous GATT agreements were openly negotiated globally through the UN system.
Okay, did everyone get the thrust of that? Yes, indeed. Okay, to you, Liz, first.
Because I think I brought GATT up in my presentation. It's something the Labour Party from the 50s played quite a role in putting in place. There was a trade agreement that did a good job, I think, over 2 or 3 decades of raising living standards right across the world. I think my answer to your question is the principle of it would be yes. Whether the UN would actually be up for doing that, I think is the difficult challenge. The world as we live in now is to become just so broken down into great big trade blocs, the US and the EU being 2 of the largest. I think we need to concentrate on how do we practically put in place trade agreements which benefit working people in as many ways as we can in those areas, and remove as best we can the advantages that accrue to big corporations and those sorts of agreements. That's what I'd like to see us do. Whether going back to negotiating that through the UN would be the best way of achieving that, I'm not so sure. I think we need to progress. We need to keep on with the way of what we're doing, but take out the worst of those sorts of agreements to the advantage of all.
Thank you, Mike. Drew?
I don't know the UN negotiating procedure, but what you did ask was, would we look for open, transparent negotiation? The answer to that would be emphatically yes.
Edward.
Drew and I are going to agree. Open and honest negotiation. I don't believe so that's where we agree. I'm going to make an observation. I think this is best dealt with the European Union. I'm a supporter of the European Union. I think it's a great market for us, a great market for Scotland, and we shouldn't ignore it. And we should put our faith in it, and we should make sure they're accountable, which is why I believe that having the 3 levels of check that I outlined in my speech at the beginning about what the EU are doing and how we can keep track of them is good. So I'm not for the UN, I'm afraid. I'm for the EU, and I want to see it open and accountable. And I believe it is. I've looked up a huge amount on Ttip since I knew this was coming along. And there's a lot out there if you delve in.
Thank you, Edward.
Yep, so I'm still reeling at the short answer from Drew. I think it's the first time I've heard to give a 1-sentence answer. Well done.
You should listen to me more.
Yes, more transparency, absolutely. But again, we're missing the bigger picture here. I feel like we're, just going over the nitty-gritty details here, but what we need to do is absolutely be in total opposition to these things. We need to look at the people rather than these massive corporations. We need to be looking at what trade can we have that supports citizens, not corporations. And how that's done, whether it's done through the UN, again, I'm not particularly familiar with that, but that needs to be the principle around what we're looking for and what we're hoping to achieve, rather than allowing these corporations to come in and take this corporate power grab that we keep hearing about. And as I've been doing my research as well on this, there's loads of trade organisations that are being discussed at the moment. There's one very frightening one that I only read about today, which is looking specifically at public services and how they can be privatised. So this is only one of many things that we need to be standing up against, and it's encouraging that it's got a big name now and that people do understand and know what Ttip is, but we need to look at the bigger picture as well.
Thank you, Ella. Gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm Billy Donald from People's NHS. We've been campaigning on Ttip for the last 6 months, and the reason we picked the NHS was because nobody had ever heard of Ttip, and it was an area where we could bring people together to get momentum on it. My question to the panel is, if you, I would like you to sign a pledge saying, if you were the candidate for this area to put in, would you contact the Prime Minister and openly public say you would want the NHS exempt from Ttip? That's my question to the panel.
Okay, thank you, Billy. Did people hear that? Billy's from the campaign group People's NHS, and he's asking the candidates each to, he's challenging them to pledge to get in touch with the Prime Minister and commit NHS to being excluded. And offering the facility to indeed sign Billy's petition, which is a very, very gracious offer there. So, first is Drew.
Listen carefully, Isla. Yes.
I'm going to disagree with Drew. I don't think it's in Ttip. Therefore, sorry, I'm just going to finish if I may. I don't think it's in Ttip. I don't think it's anything to be frightened of. I've certainly checked up with my party and it's gone right the way up. I've even contacted our MEP and got him to ask questions and raise actual questions and get responses in letters. I don't think it's in. I don't think I need to sign the pledge.
Is that no? That's a no. So that's a yes or no, Isla?
Yes, as well. I think, though, I'm just wondering if Ed has signed the 17-page, agreement not to discuss what the things he's found out about, because he seems to know an awful lot about it, considering that nobody else does really know the answers to those questions.
Is that yes or no?
It's
yes,
an absolute yes.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
I'll give an answer, and then I've got another comment to make. The answer is yes. Unequivocally sign your pledge, Billy. But I'm reminded, and John Finney will probably remember this as well, very similar.
John Finney always worries when someone says, John Finney will probably remember this.
At the last elections up at UHI College, Dan Alexander challenged me to sign a very similar pledge, which he also signed, on student tuition fees.
John Finney does remember. Okay, well, let Billy back in.
I'd just like to thank the panel. The other problem was every other country has used exemption. The UK and the Condé government will not use the exemption. They put the NHS on the exempt list. And even the Trade Minister, Lord Livingston, he would be better in the Scottish Parliament and the Government Committee. He would not. He said that the NHS was out of Ttip and it's still in the scope of Ttip.
Okay, Billy's suggesting there's an exempt list that sovereign states can use to exempt, and that the UK could do that for the NHS, but have chosen not to right now. This time we're going first with you, Edward.
Okay, I've just offered Billy a copy of the letter to Lord Livingston, which says that Ttip doesn't include the National Health Service. I'm very happy to give you it. Okay, so that's my view. Sorry?
I said, look, lawyers have looked at that through United Union, they've looked at it and said it's not true, it's in the scope of Ttip.
Well, I think my feeling is at the moment, Ttip negotiations are in their infancy and haven't been completed. I think there's a long way to go, but I think if if the European Commission on Trade is saying it's not in and it's prepared to write on a letter saying it's not in, I'm pretty minded to go with that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same with Kay's question. Unless it's specifically excluded, then it's within the scope for these things to happen. So if we're going to go down the route of having this trade agreement, then we have to have these very important issues, not just the NHS, as I keep saying, but other things as well, totally excluded, so that we know for sure that that's not going to happen. And I would suggest that the reason they don't want it out is because they're already privatising the NHS.
Mike?
My understanding is exactly that. I'm not quite sure if it's an exempt list as such, but there are certain moves within other European Union countries to exempt specific services like the NHS. The Labour Party supports that view. David Martin MEP has been championing that view at the European Union. Our challenge to the current Tory government is why they will not insist on that exemption in the current negotiations.
Thanks, Mike. Drew?
I'm just confused by Edward's position. If it's not included, just exempt it. What's the harm?
The double lock.
The double lock, yeah, do it.
Okay. Next question. Mr. McDonald.
Hi, I'm George McDonald. A lot of political discourse surrounding Ttip seems to be along the lines, let's hold on to what we've got, in other words, NHS and Scottish Water. I'm disappointed that there's no political vision from a lot of the main political parties overblowing the offensive and saying, rather than hold on to what we've got, we're going to nationalise and take into public ownership our oil, our gas, our electricity, our railways, our banks, and all our other vital public services, including Royal Mail.
For those who didn't see, George pointed to his logo. He is one of our valued Royal Mail employees. Isla, there's no, people aren't being bold enough.
Absolutely. Just echoing my own sentiments there. We need to see not only that these things are exempt, but that we're actively looking at them. So, yeah, I agree.
Mike?
I think this is maybe where we do start to bring a bit of political difference into this discussion, George. One of the questions that Drew was asked earlier was about why the SNP are just focused on the NHS. And I think there's a great myth has grown up that the SNP are somehow a left-wing political party. I don't believe that's the case. The Labour Party has already started talking about renationalising the rail industry in Scotland. That's something we'd like to see. And I think there are strong movements growing within the Labour Party to extend that to other parts of the country as well. Royal Mail's a case in point. I think it's an absolute disgrace what has been done with Royal Mail in this country. And I think that's something we should look at very seriously and bring it back to public ownership at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Mike. Drew?
Well, I think it's a bit rich for Mike, whose party's not had a fag paper between him and the Tories to come on and talk about being left of centre. I think our credentials are absolutely clear for people. But let's direct the question to those things that ought to have a public service obligation, and one that's actually protected by public ownership. The Royal Mail should never have been privatised. We shouldn't have the problem in the Highlands of worrying about delivery charges and worrying about whether or not we're going to have post offices in our communities. That should just not have happened. I do think that is a service that should absolutely be in public hands.
Okay, thank you, Drew. Edward?
Well, you're not going to be surprised that I'm not going to...
Oh, it's surprising.
And say that I want to see services that are in private ownership to put back into public ownership through nationalisation. I think that we have to be very careful, that we have to make sure that what we need as a country actually is provided, and rather than take it back into public ownership, which in many cases did not provide what we needed and was actually very costly and didn't work particularly well. I don't think that's the way forward. But I think we're a long way from Ttip. But to bring it back to Ttip, if I may, I think I actually read out that comment to say, you know, should I not win the election up here and be part of a majority government, that there's nothing, hold on, let me just actually get the quote, there's nothing to stop you renationalising services if you want to within the Ttip agreement. In fact, you can actually do it providing you protect the property rights of those people who are owning it. So you could do it if the Conservatives don't get back in, but if I get in, I won't be supporting it.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Woman up the back, Maggie.
Yeah, what should the candidates say that these talks and discussions need to be brought out behind closed doors? If you were elected in May, what specific steps would each of you take to ensure that Ttip was put to the forefront of public debate?
Did everyone hear the question? People in the front? Do you know? No. The questioner's asking the panel, there's been a lot of comment about the discussions taking place in private. What would the candidates do if they were elected in May to bring the discussions out into the public domain? Mike?
As I understand it, the key to the discussions and negotiations is what I think it's got a complex name, but it's essentially the agenda, the negotiation agenda that the European Commissioners are being allowed to negotiate about. And I think the specific step that has to be taken is for the UK government to be very explicit about what it wants to see included in that agenda, what it wants to see excluded, and what it needs to see included. So that will be a job for our UK ministers of trade and business and our European MEPs working in the Social Democratic Group to make sure that agenda is set with the terms that we want to see.
Drew? Thank you, Mike.
Well, I think that clearly, earlier on when I was asked the question about open and transparent negotiations, I think that's something that's very important to keep pursuing. I think it will be an issue that's very much in the public domain anyway. I think it will be a matter of the running business in the next Parliament, particularly for the early part of it, given that Ttip is now so close. So I would keep the focus on there. But the real difficulty at the moment is that whilst it is still kept in secret, while we don't have that open, transparent process, it's difficult to actually know what's going on with it. So I think the first thing that we have to do is try to make sure that we get to that open, transparent process and see how this is actually going to affect us and see what we can actually pull out from the European Union at the moment, because it is just impossible to know what's going on there. It's just absolutely impossible to do it. So I think it'll be in the public. I think it will be in the public eye anyway, and I'd look to continue to make sure that we bring it into the light so that we can see the details of this.
Thank you, Drew. Edward?
Maggie, I think you're right, and I think everyone's right here. It needs to be right out in the public domain. So, first of all, apart from me getting them to change their website IP address, which is completely impronounceable, I want to see all the documents relating to this actually put on the internet, and I'll do everything that I can, if elected, to ensure that. Let me give you another assurance, that if I'm not elected, that I will continue my quest of raising questions in the European Parliament, which is being done. I've actually invited Phil Hogan, the Commissioner for Agriculture, to come over to Scotland and talk to farmers in Scotland about Ttip and how it will affect farmers. I'm waiting for a response on that, but that's the kind of proactive step that I'd like to see. And I'd like to see some of these, dare I say it, faceless bureaucrats in the European Union coming down to our level and talking to us about the very real affairs that they're negotiating on our behalf. So elected, I'm going to do something. Not elected, I'm still going to fight because it's very important to me.
Okay, thank you, Edward. Gentleman at the back.
No, oh,
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Maybe it's
I'm too quick with that pencils. Yeah.
Maybe you forgot because I'm only 125 to 1 at the bookies for winning. But if I, it is a good bet. If I did bet, then I would. But it's a very good question, Maggie, because I was interested to know exactly what steps would be taken as well. And I, like Edward, whether I was elected or not, will be continuing to campaign on this and trying to hold it up to the light, as I would on any of these types of globalised corporate deals that are trying to take place at the moment. So, yeah.
Okay, apologies again. First the gentleman at the back, then the gentleman in front of him. So at the very back, please.
Social care is actually like private providers.
with respect, that's a terribly important issue. It's an issue very dear to my own personal heart. Can we leave that in, and if we run out of TTIP, we'll certainly come back to that. The gentleman in the front there, yes. Don, is it? Donald, right. Donald, right, okay, it's Donald. Yes, indeed. Donald, can you maybe speak up a wee bit? Edwards.
My name's Donald Clark. I've listened to all the candidates, I listened to all the 5 minutes now, and they took the board what they said, but most of it I'll go to ISLA. She said that meant a lot to me. We've heard a lot with the NHS, we've heard a lot with business and all that, but what about the workers? What about us? You know, America is very anti-union. What's going to happen to all our workers' rights? What's going to happen to health and safety? What's going to happen to the food services? What rights are us the workers going to have? Now, you know, God forbid if the condemned government capacity, and they really don't care about workers. If this trade deal is going to happen with America, what's going to happen to us? You know.
Okay, thank you. I recognise Donald from asking a similar question at Open last week. Good to see you again. And Donald, for those who didn't hear it, Donald's question is about what the specific implications are for workers' rights, which he refers to as being hard fought for, quite rightly so, and health and safety issues. And Drew this time.
Well, I think it's very difficult to know the impact on the detail for the TTIP negotiations for the reasons that have been well rehearsed tonight. We just don't know the details. The reason for the trade agreements, obviously, the people who argue for the trade agreement has obviously come from a position of saying that if you are going to get £4 to £10 billion per year annually in the UK coming into the economy, they would say that that would create jobs and obviously stimulate trade in the economy. So there may be in the detail there some benefits that actually support work and employment and allow people to actually invest the economy in that way. The difficulty, I think, for your question is that you're saying what would happen in terms of rights. And the only answer I can give at the moment in the darkness of the details that are there at the moment is that I would expect the European employment laws that are in place at the moment to be central part of the negotiations. But I can't give you a clear answer on that because I just don't know what is in the detail there. And it is a worry, which is why we need an open and transparent process as opposed to a closed door.
Thank you, Joe. Edward?
First of all, Donald, I think you're right. We don't want to lower standards. And one of the main negotiating positions that has been made clear to the Trade Commissioner is not to lower the standards. And I can't stress enough, this reflects across all of these things, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's rights of trade unions, whether it's food standards. We cannot reduce our standards.
And workers at the moment is at an all-time low, at around 50.5% at the moment, an all-time low. And that, it's not even a true figure because that takes into account the pay of top-end executives as well as the low end. So we'd like to see that these kind of figures are ones that are the real focus of trade agreements to make sure that workers are getting a fair deal. And things like executive pay ratios is one that we're really keen on because the ratios between the lowest earner in an organisation and the highest earner is now at the biggest gap that it's ever been at, and quite often sometimes over 400%. It never used to be that way. With Edward's talking about the stuff that the Conservatives do, of course they don't want this stuff to be excluded from these trade agreements because they're trying to get in by the back door to do these things anyway, all by themselves. They don't need any trade agreements to do them. They literally had a bonfire of legislation that protected the environment, protected workers' rights and protected against these standardisations for our food. So, you know, they're all for it because they want to do these things themselves anyway. It doesn't surprise you that
One of the differences with the Labour Party that is evolving under Ed Miliband is we believe that you don't just let big corporations and market forces, as a lot of people used to think, just do their thing. You have to actually intervene to achieve the outcomes that you actually want to see. And that's why I've said quite explicitly in our presentation, the Labour Party isn't just going to sit there and say, we don't know what's going on in these negotiations. When it comes to things like workers' rights and standards, we want explicitly to see standards and regulations written into the TTIP agreement that will at least protect worker standards that they currently have, and where we can, enforce better standards in the US and other countries through those trade agreements.
Thank you, Mike. Yes?
Shale gas extraction is a big concern at the moment. And under NAFTA, the Canadian government has sued for $250 million over a moratorium on fracking in Quebec by an oil and gas company. What definite checks would there be within TTIP to make sure this never happens in the UK?
Okay. Sorry, what's your name?
Joanne Patterson.
Joanne's asking about fracking, shale gas, unconventional gas extraction, and what checks there would be in TTIP to ensure that that wouldn't take place. And it's first to Edward.
Oh, okay. No, he's really quick here. Okay, on fracking, fracking is covered by planning legislation. It's actually up to governments to decide whether they want to allow, within the planning law, fracking to go on. And hence why we have, in the situation in Scotland at the moment, the Scottish Government have said that they don't want any fracking to go on. That cannot be changed by TTIP. It cannot get involved in that sort of legislation. It just can't happen, because that's not what's being negotiated. What's being negotiated is free trade, not a breakdown of the laws of the country where trade is being carried out. So it just can't happen.
Ayla.
It can't happen, and yet we can be sued if it does happen. So, this is the thing, you're saying it can't happen. As long as investor-state dispute settlement is in TTIP, then a company will have the right to go to a private court of law, not a judicial system, but through this corporate arbitration panel of lawyers to sue us. And it's happening, as you say, to other countries. The other big one is the Vattenfall. They're suing Germany, because Germany decided in the wake of Fukushima that they didn't want to have nuclear power anymore. Wham, there they are, into a lawsuit. So these things, they will happen, and we will end up in big trouble with them. So we have to be opposed to it now.
Thank you. Mike?
Two things. I think in terms of TTIP itself, the key is having specific exclusions with the ISDS arrangements, which allow sovereign governments to exclude or make decisions that are clearly in public interest without risk of legal comeback. I think that's really important. When it comes to fracking itself, I think I'll sum up my attitude to that one block, and that's bananas.
Thank you, Mike. I'm racing ahead with these wee columns, that's what it is. I'm sorry, on you go. Beg your pardon.
I think there's a real danger with the situation in Canada and the moratorium. We've quite rightly put a moratorium in place here in Scotland because there's just too many unknowns about fracking at the moment, just too much risk involved with that, and we need to know what's involved with it. The Scottish Government's position is very clear, the SNP's position is very clear. I mentioned it earlier that TTIP must not give current or future US investors the right to sue, or the rights that they could use to sue any level of government or public authority. And I think that is something that we must be strong on, and we must make sure that's protected. So along with the NHS, it's absolutely vital that they don't have the rights, they don't have the ability to use a right to sue.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yes, young man?
Edward's gone on about how he's being able to access all this information. The only reason you've been able to do that is because people have gone out there and they've fought against TTIP. A couple of years ago, you would not have that information. It's only come out because people have been fighting against it.
Okay, sorry, didn't catch your name.
Fergus.
Fergus, thank you. Isla, the information's only there. Fergus was saying the information's only there because people fought for it to be there.
Absolutely, it is. We're only all here because everybody's now bringing it to light, and we're all talking about it. But still, loads. I mean, I'm out in the high street and I'm speaking to people, and we've got specific TTIP leaflets because it is one of the big things that we're actively campaigning on. And you're saying to people, can I speak to you about TTIP? What's that? You're still hearing that all the time. So there's loads of people that don't know about it. But absolutely, it's only because we're actually fighting against it that anybody actually knows anything about it. And it's not the first time it's happened. It's not the last time it will happen. And it's not the only thing that's happening. So it's part of a whole movement that we have to make sure. And at the risk of doing a little bit of an electioneering, which I've been accusing Drew of doing, if you want to make sure that these things don't happen, then you have to put your vote with a party that will make sure these things don't happen. And I would say, vote Green.
Well, for the avoidance of doubt, I thought they were all here electioneering, so I thought that's what it was all about. But Mike?
I live in the internet world and all the power and the knowledge and the information that can bring. But you can only go looking for stuff if you actually know that it's there. So I think the power of these kind of meetings and the explosion in democracy and the interest in politics has been, I think, one of the positive outcomes of the referendum last year. It's allowed people to decide, I'm going to have an interest in this, I'm going to find out about it, and I'm not going to let big government, whatever form it actually comes about, pull the rule over my ears. I'll give you something, a very snappy acronym, TTIP, without people really understanding what it's all about and the implications for them as ordinary people.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, first of all, thank you, Tyler, for finally giving up on attacking my answers all the time. That you've admitted you're a politician as well at last. It's good to see you join the table with it. Can I just say that the issue about this being in a public domain and people being made aware of it, I think has been aided greatly by the People's NHS. I think the fact that they have been able to bring forward an issue that people can connect with and understand is a great service to the overall campaign about getting an exclusion for the NHS and building greater understanding and transparency for Ttip overall. And I think it's things like that that connect with the public. If I go onto a doorstep, and I've been on many during this campaign, and I speak to people, people are not asking me about Ttip. It's not the first question I'm asked about. It's not the last question I'm asked about. What they are asking about is the NHS, because that's important to them. And being able to bring that into context, I think, is incredibly valuable. So when we're talking about this, I think it's really important that we do relate it to people's everyday lives. And I think that's the power that we've seen of people being able to look at the individual aspects that are going to affect them, be it workers' rights or be it the NHS. I think when you boil it right down to the things that matter to people in their homes and in their communities, that's when it strikes a chord.
Thank you.
Fergus, you're right. It's because people fight to get the information out there. And one of the things I enjoy about doing what I'm doing, which is standing at this election, is learning more and more every day, a little bit more on every subject. Because every time you come to a meeting like this, or any other meeting, you have to research, and you do a huge amount of research. I think we've all researched before we come here. I've spent hours trawling through the internet. I've been hours speaking to people. I've been prepping, once I got this first question, to get a question raised to Commissioner Hogan in the European Union. And it's right, and people have fought, and it's made me fight. What I do think, though, is important, and we shouldn't lose sight of, and it's something I feel very strongly about, is that sometimes we give too much power to the European Union, and we allow what we should control to drift slightly too much their way. Which is why I personally would like to see our whole role within the European renegotiated, redefined with new lines, and then for us to decide why we should stay in or we should move out of the European Union. I personally favour staying in, but I do think that there are secret things that go on within the European Union, and I'm not happy with that. And that's why I welcome what our party's doing to open it all up. But you're right, fight for it, and we'll get there. And I'm very glad that people have. I don't mind who they are fighting for it. It's made me learn, and I've learned a lot on this whole process.
Thank you. Gentlemen in that green.
David Smith,
sorry, name again, sorry, we're all a wee bit deaf up the front here.
David Smith.
David, thank you, David.
Given all the answers there, and democracy is the greatest gift we all have, surely we're heading towards a hung parliament or a new coalition parliament with no one inside. Surely Ttip should be put on the back burner. Everyone should veto it and say, no,
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, well, just David was talking about given all the disagreement there is and the electoral combinations that may arise, would it not be appropriate to put this in the back burner at this time? Or to return to your leaders and give them direction, I think was the suggestion. Mike, yours first.
I'll try and stay out of the politics of coalition.
Please do.
Answer the question, so I think in the sense in which you did. I think the issue is that coalition, whether it's a coalition government or a majority government, the world goes on. And I think, as I said in my opening remarks, trade agreements between major economic powerhouses in the world, the US and the European Union, need to be regulated, need to regulate that trade. So whether it's a watered down version of Ttip or a heavily constrained version of Ttip, I would like to see. I think those negotiations still have to continue. I think it would be for a coalition government in whatever form to find a way to drive those negotiations through.
Thank you, Mike. Drew?
Mike said earlier that he reckoned that David Miliband was emerging. I think actually submerging, and I think we are. Sorry, I think the question was about, are we heading for a hung parliament, and could we, therefore veto the Ttip agreement? We've said many times we don't really know what the detail is in it, but I think the fundamental thing that I do think I understand correctly from the situation is that it's an either yes or no question once the European Union has actually put the deal together. So I don't think it's a matter of vetoing it. I don't think that's allowed under the process, which is a real difficulty because nobody knows what's going on with it for reasons that have been well rehearsed over and over again tonight. So that's the thing. You're either in or you're out, and that's going to be decided on the UK level. In terms of the hung parliament, it might not be a coalition. It might be a minority government. And there might be an ability there to influence some of that when it comes along. But I'm pretty sure that it's either an in-out or agreement. I don't think there's a veto on it.
Thank you, Drew. Edward?
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I'm not going to talk about a coalition government because we're not actually campaigning for a coalition government. And we haven't got Danny here to defend why he thought it was a good idea. But we're not campaigning for a thing. The other thing I'd like to make sure and clear, Drew, is you said that Ed was submerging. That's a different Ed to the Ed that's here tonight. I'm not submerging. I'm still very buoyant. And I absolutely believe, as far as Ttip is concerned, we can't just shelve it and pause it. Now, we are on round 8 of the negotiations, and we are still at this stage in Ttip trying to sort out the basic rules for negotiation. I think personally that we're still years away from an agreement, and I think providing the European Union negotiators, the Trade Commission, are open about this, it can continue. And I think that all the parties will then come to a common position, because there are some things that all of us are not keen on happening. And from that point of view, I think it can continue, because I think there will be a clear position which we can all coalesce behind. That's what I'm hoping for, coalescing behind something that's in the interests of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Edward.
I agree with Edward in terms of the fact that it's very interesting being part of this process, because you learn loads, and I've learned absolutely heaps in the last couple of months. And I think Drew's right, it's a yes and a no when it comes to the ratification, and Ed's right as well, it's going to take several years before we get to that process. Obviously, I think I've made it clear that I'd like that to be a big fat no, that we definitely don't want to have anything to do with it. In terms of how we would go about doing that in terms of having Parliament, I'm really not sure. As I say, with big odds against me, in my thoughts in terms of actually how I would go about doing stuff as one green lonely voice from Scotland down there.
We're not planning a majority green government.
We're not planning a majority, well, we would love a majority green government, then we could do exactly what you said, and we could say no to these things and concentrate on environmental and people issues. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen this time round. But we're well on that path. Sorry, Dave, to disappoint you, because I know that you think that is happening.
Well, it's good that we've got 4 optimistic candidates from a range of parties there.
Cool. Hiya, Eddie Morgan. I would just like to talk about TTIP in, and I'm sure we'd all agree that it is a trade deal would be is essential for the creation of wealth. I'm sure we can all agree on that. So my question would be back to echo what the guy said earlier about the workers mostly. The creation of wealth, as we know, through capitalism is mostly extracted through the environment and through labour. Okay, so bearing that in mind, around half of US states have now adopted anti-trade union legislation under the so-called right-to-work framework, an anti-trade union legislation framework that undermines trade union finances and allows businesses to undercut workers' pay, health insurance and pensions. There is a concern that European companies may take advantage of the ease of market access created by TTIP to relocate to the USA and take advantage of the weak labour regulations described above. Similarly, there is also danger that American companies may be encouraged by the TTIP to relocate to EU states, such as Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, where incomes are low and trade unions are weaker than in other parts of the EU. So what I'm saying is that to make a profit, you need to, you need to extract the profit, and in order to do that, you have to force down costs. You have to compete. So what would be wrong with this statement? Why would the US not want to go to other countries in Europe where they don't have as much rights or there's cheaper labour? So it's the whole idea of what is the trade deal for? Where does the wealth go? Does it go up or does it come down?
Okay, that was a long question. I'll try my very best to summary.
Right.
It was another Ed, and Ed talked about how wealth is generated both from the workforce or extracted from the environment. He mentioned that half the US states have anti-trade union legislation and wondered if this would result in relocation, as has previously been the case, and how TTIP would impact on that. Is that a fair summary, Ed?
Yeah, it's just of a trade deal. What I'd like to ask the panel is when you say it's going to benefit everybody, or it has potential to benefit everybody, when you say everybody, I don't see how it would benefit me as a working class person. I can see how it can benefit corporations.
Okay, and Ed added to that, he would like to know who would benefit from that, and if you could answer that with regard to the comments about the anti-trade union legislation that's been adopted in a number of the states and how that would impact. So this time we start with Ed Turner.
Ed, I feel I should call you David just to get the form up here tonight. I think you raise a question that's impossible to answer, to be honest, because we don't know the implications of the negotiations and the trade deal.
But what? Sorry, can I just interrupt?
Sure,
yeah. What I'm saying is the essence of a trade deal is to create wealth, and I'm asking where does the wealth go? TTIP to me is no different from any other bilateral trade agreement.
Well, trade deals, you're
a critique in capitalism, I think we have here. Drew, where does the wealth go?
Well, the answer is unless you know what the specific circumstances, you don't know where the wealth goes. And
but bearing in mind the history of evidence, sorry, I'm just asking you to
be more specific.
I'll be more specific. What I mean is that the history and the evidence, Marie evidenced quite a lot of all what's going around in the world with trade agreements. So if we establish that TTIP is essentially different from that, I'm asking you.
This time I'll try and answer these, and the best I can with that, Ed. The difference between this and another trade deal is unknown. I don't think all trade deals are bad. And trade deals, for example, if you take a local company like LifeScan, for example, they have patents which are at risk of not being recognised internationally. They could lose their patents if they're not involved in a trade deal. So all trade deals don't necessarily involve direct profit, or at least, I suppose they do at the end of the day, but sometimes they'll protect intellectual property or things like that. So a specific trade deal is going to be different depending on the different circumstances you have. The real problem we've got, and the reason it's impossible to give you an answer particularly about how it works in those European states, and I speak with a wee bit of knowledge on Romania because I'm an honorary consul to Romania for the Highlands and Islands, and they wouldn't know either. Of course, they're a competitive state with other states in Europe in the same way that we are, and we'd look to try and attract trade and investment in exactly the same way. But we just don't know what the detail of the TTIP agreement is, and it's just impossible to answer what would the effects be of that trade deal.
Okay, thank you, Ed.
I'm not sure I can actually give you a specific answer down to a specific person. Oh, that's my tango. Where the money's going to go. But let me just say, At the moment, our sportswear, when it goes, thank you. Our sportswear, when it goes out to the United States, attracts a 32% tariff. Now, that's not a good thing. We should be able to get our sportswear out there without attracting any tariff. As a farmer, I can't export all the things that I would like to see from my farm to America. Meat-wise, they're not, well, they will allow it, but there's huge restrictions placed on it. Now, therefore, if I can see it opened up and see a bit more free trade, that's got to be good. Now, where we probably disagree, it's the figure that I've got from the European Union is €545 or £433 per year for a family of 4. That's how much trade it's going to bring into Europe by having free trade with America. Now, if that money does trickle down to the families and actually gets down to each household in the European Union, that's got to be good, and that's what I would like to see. Just as far as migrating, you know, and saying, well, of course, UK companies are going to say, well, it's much easier, we can be much harder on our workforce if we shifted all out to America, because they've got lower union rights, they've got lower health and safety rights. You know, that just is not going to happen. I just do not believe that's going to happen. I believe that the companies that are established in this country now and within Europe will want to stay within Europe because Europe is their main market, although it will opening up America will give them an added market. So I'm much more sanguine about it. And in fairness, if it comes down to me, if it's just moving your workforce away so you can exploit them, I'm not up for that. And if I'm elected, I'll fight that every inch of the way. So you've got my assurance on that.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. Isla?
You're right. The history is there. The history is there to show us that these things do happen, that it goes down towards this cheapest labour market where the profits can be made as much as possible. So there is history there, there is evidence there that these things will happen, and that's absolutely why we should be against it. I think that trade deals should focus very much on fair trade and not free trade. We should be looking at making sure that the trade is fairly done, that we have the workers' rights, we have the standards there, and we have the social, economic things happening there as well. I read a lovely thing, I've written it down here, that I heard an Irish singer, Damien Dempsey, he was on Radio 2 the other day, and he had this lovely saying. He said that at the moment what we're seeing is that they're privatising the profit and socialising the debt. And that's exactly what we're seeing all the time just now. And the more and more you read in it, the more and more it makes you very, very mad. And it's the reason why I'm sitting here now, because I've had enough. I've had enough of all this privatising profits and socialising debt. So trade agreements should be about making sure the reverse is opposite. Not that we get more free trade, but that we get much more fair trade. And in answer to, like, you know, when Ed's saying that he wants to be able to open up his market to export his farm produce to the States, I'd rather sell my farm produce to my local community and economy. I'd rather have a marketplace where I can sell my local produce to you guys, rather than having to ship it out, and rather than having to compete with these massive global organisations.
I'm sitting here listening to Drew and to Edward, and I'm beginning to feel like I'm an old Labourite harking back to the days of the old command economy. I don't think it's good enough just to leave it to the market and say it'll all be all seen in the night. I don't think it's good enough to say, you know, we don't really know. I think you've actually got to take a view and say we'll intervene, we'll make a difference. And as I said earlier, there are things the Labour Party absolutely wants to see written into quite explicitly to protect workers' rights and improve standards. I'll give you another example. One of the things the Labour Party said very explicitly is we'll try and get rid of zero wage pay in this country. That's a deliberate intervention in the market to say we think that's a fundamentally wrong way to pay people and we want to change it. That's what the Labour Party's about.
Yeah, you're in favour of
Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got one final question. I'll take it from the gentleman there. Yes, you, sir. Yes. Can you make it a very short question? We'll need a very short answer from each of the candidates, please.
My name is Kenneth Carman, and I'm a member of the Scottish Christian Party.
Kenneth,
and
right.
my question to you is, how can politicians justify
to you, Edward. You're first with this one. 13% rise for politicians.
I'm not going to justify it. It's not right. You know, if you're going to take pain, one thing I learned when I was in the army, if you're going to take pain, you share the pain as part of a team. And I don't think it's right. Don't ask me to justify it. I'm not going to.
So you get it to the lower work?
No, what I'm saying is that I won't, if elected, I won't be putting up a pay rise to myself or any of my colleagues to that level. If the public sector are getting a reduced and a capped pay rise, so should our politicians.
Isla?
Yeah, it's absolutely sickening that things like that are happening at the moment, and it's happening all the time. I think I've been quite clear in my views on those types of issues. If there was a prize for being the leftist, but I think I'd definitely get it on this panel. So, yeah, absolutely, these types of things shouldn't happen. It's absolutely disgusting when you see MPs claiming that they can't live on £67,000 a year. I'm sure I could probably give it a good try if you were to elect me. But yes, it's not right.
Okay, well, I now realise I've breached my own undertaking here about it being Ttip, because it's very stretching it to put that into Ttip. A very brief answer from each of you, please, and then we'll, in fairness, take the gentleman at the back there for a very brief answer.
I'll be very brief. Uncomfortable though it is to find myself agreeing with Edward.
It's inexcusable. I think in Scotland we've set the right example, particularly in local authorities, by saying that we will not have a pay rise above what the workers are getting.
First Minister.
Okay. Now, at the risk of offending our host, since the gentleman at the back there, since I allowed that one, you had a question about the effect of health and social care in the Highlands. Was that correct?
I think it's easy to get confidence when we talk about Europe-wide issues of trade, whenever it comes to privatisation and control of public services. But something my concern from a innocent point of view in the Highlands is that the NHS is farming more care out of the private sector, care at home and residential care. So just be interested, that's something that touches on all the principles we're talking about tonight. I'd be interested on the views of the panel.
Okay, sorry, missed your name?
Larkin Mull.
Still missed it, sorry?
Larkin Mull.
Larkin, right, okay, thank you very much indeed, Larkin. Edward, you first, sorry, we're on to Isla first this time.
Sorry, can you
yes,
sorry,
okay.
I've spent far too long having tank guns firing in my ear to be able to hear at the back. Can you just speak it up? Sorry.
Larkin asked a question, it's just a very brief answer. It's about, we've talked about all the wider challenges, yet within the Highlands, health and social care, delivery of care at home, and care homes indeed, is in the control of the private sector in many instances. Yes. Isla, a very brief comment on that, please.
Yeah, as you can imagine, I'm against the privatisation of anything. And really, what we're seeing is it's very dangerous to have, particularly in the Highlands, the privatisation of social care because it's not profitable. It's going to cost us much more to service a population that is so widespread. And it's vital, absolutely vital for us in the Highlands that we keep these things under public control.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Privatisation in the health service is something I'm fundamentally opposed to, but we need to recognise it's been driven by two things, both of which we need to address. I think predominantly in England, it's been driven, certainly under the coalition government, on ideological grounds. They want to get those services out of their friendly business. And it's also been driven on grounds of cost reduction. We need to tackle that as well. We need to find ways to put more money, raise more money in the economy, put into those services.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Drew?
I know we've not got very much time, but I'd just like to give you the example of the Glenurquhart Care Project, which I was out to see last week and have been very much involved in terms of a good example of where actually care is being taken forward by a social enterprise. It's a community getting together to actually work out a way, in a very successful way and a very popular way with the people that use that facility, to get them out of hospital, to get them out of their hospital bed and work them back through daycare into their own homes. And that's worked with the community at no profit. And I think that's a really good shining example of where you can use services out with the existing NHS or social care system and actually support that kind of thing. As for privatisation, of course, we can't allow that to run rampant. And I think the one thing I would agree with Mike about is that there is impact on the ongoing privatisation in England in terms of the funding for NHS Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Finally.
First of all, the most important thing in my mind for the National Health Service is to make sure we're getting the best possible result for our patients. And I'm not going to talk about privatisation. We could talk about Weight Watchers in Glasgow being employed by the Scottish Government, a US company to do private work for the NHS. Not worth it. What I want to talk about, in my mind, is what I think the fundamental issue is for me with the National Health Service. And that is getting the managers closer to the coalface, so they actually understand what the problems are and try and resolve it, rather than being driven by paperwork, figures, accountability on issues for targets. What I want to do is get them in there so they can see what the people on the front line are dealing with. And I think they've become too remote. If we can get them more driven into the National Health Service at the coalface, I think we'll get a better result for all the patients that expect it and have a right to achieve it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to the panel for these brief answers, as brief as politicians can ever make answers. At the end there, now we had 7 minutes of non-Ttip, so hopefully the European Citizens Initiative aren't too offended for that. I have a number of thanks to make at this point. I'd like to thank the staff of the Spectrum Centre for the way they've assisted us. I would like to thank your good selves for coming along. I would like to thank the European Citizens Initiative for organising this, and I would like to thank Mary for all the work she puts in, just not only to this, and I understand that there are indeed to be 2 further ones. I would like to thank our candidates for giving up their valuable time and for giving such informed answers to you. And I'd like to wish you all a safe journey home. Well done.